The events of this story started in 1996, when Peter was only 10 years old. He was a smart and obedient child, living in his parents' house in the countryside. Peter's father owned a large farm, and he and his wife, Peter's mother, shared all the work on the farm, in agriculture and animal husbandry, even honey production. The business was thriving, and the profits were good. And Mr. George, Peter's father, used to employ many farmers to help him and his wife in all the work. Mr. George's farm was surrounded by many other farms, and on the other side there was a large forest, which was an excellent destination for camping lovers and walking in nature, which is why many people used to go to that forest and were always keen to buy various products from farms in the same area, including Mr. George's farm. Mr. George's house, despite all his possessions, was simple, consisting of one floor, divided internally into only 3 rooms. The family was small and did not need more than that. One day, when Peter was 1 year old, a dog appeared in front of the house, which clearly appeared to be a hybrid, but predominantly wolf dogs. As soon as Mrs. Lydia, Peter's mother, saw this dog, she fell in love with him, especially since the dog was affectionate and loved Peter very much and was keen to protect him all the time. That is why Mrs. Lydia decided to keep the dog and consider it the family pet. She named him Hugo, and when Peter grew up and became 5 years old, his father fell into a bad psychological state and became addicted to alcohol. He often got drunk, and here the dog Hugo prevented Mr. George from approaching Peter completely, as if he realized that his father might harm him. When Peter grew up and became of school age, Hugo was accustomed to walking next to him every morning as if he were taking him to school, and he would return home and wait for him in front of the door of the house to welcome him and check on him. There was a strong friendship between Peter and Hugo, and we are not exaggerating when we say that Peter considered like a brother to him. The work on Mr. George's farm increased, and Mr. George and Mrs. Lydia became more busy, especially after Mr. George decided to supply the products of his farm to one of the nearby stores in order to sell them to tourists and visitors to the place. This idea achieved great profits, and that is why Mr. George and Mrs. Lydia devoted all their time to it. But it was the only problem is Peter. Work required Mr. George and Mrs. Lydia to go out for long periods of time, which put them in a constant state of worry about Peter, especially during school vacations. Therefore, it was necessary to think of an alternative solution, especially since Peter tried to go with his father, and his mother went to work. He was very bored and did not like it, so Mr. George suggested that Peter go spend time with Mr. O's kids. Mr. O welcomed the idea, especially since he knew that his children loved Peter and had no problem with Peter being with them. Peter's visits to Mr. O's house and farm continued on a daily basis, and it was going well. One day, Peter felt bored, so he decided to go out for a little walk in the woods next to the farm. Peter continued walking for a long distance until he lost his way, so he decided to walk straight in order to reach any road that could take him to his house or to Mr. O's house. But after a long time, he reached a strange road. This was the first time that Peter walked on. This road, he was tired, exhausted, and afraid. When he was walking on this road, he noticed a truck approaching him and actually stopped next to him. When that truck stopped, a man and a woman got out. The woman asked Peter, "Where are your parents?" Peter replied, "On the farm. I'm here alone." Peter knew that what he had just done was wrong. His mother had asked him more than once not to talk to strangers, but he forgot as usual. Then he heard the woman say, "It's perfect. There's no one here. Hold on him, Marcus." Peter immediately started running from the place, and at the same time he saw Hugo coming out of nowhere. Hugo came out from the direction of the forest where Peter had been walking minutes ago and grabbed the man's right arm with his mouth, which he was extending in order to catch Peter. The man screamed in pain, and the woman felt afraid and ran towards the car. And here Peter continued running away from the man and the woman. Then Hugo let go of the man's hand, but Peter was certain that the man's arm was broken, as he heard the sound of his arm being broken and saw blood falling from the man's arm where Hugo's fangs were. Hugo was a huge, strong, and brave dog. As soon as Hugo let go of the man's arm, he quickly returned to his car and immediately drove away. Peter stopped when he was sure that the man and woman had completely moved away, and then Hugo went in Peter's direction as if he wanted to take him home. And indeed, Hugo walked in front of Peter as if showing him the way, until Peter arrived at Mr. O's farm. Mr. O was standing anxiously in front of the door of his farm. When he saw Peter, he asked him where he was, and then Peter told him what had just happened to him, and Mr. Rowe looked at him angry and upset and told him that lying is a sin and he should not do this. But Peter insisted that he was not lying and that this is exactly what happened to him and that he could take Mr. Rowe to Hugo's place. But when they went there, Hugo was not there. Peter felt strange and assured Mr. He returned to his house and did not find Hugo receiving him as usual or welcoming him. When he entered, he asked Mr. George and Mrs. Lydia where Hugo was, and then Mrs. Lydia began to cry. As for Mr. George, he approached Peter and put his hand on his shoulder and told him that his mother, Mrs. Lydia, had decided in the morning to return home because she forgot some important papers, and when she arrived home, she found Hugo dead. And indeed, Mr. George called Mr. Rowe in the morning and told him what had happened in order to delay Peter's return until Mr. George finished burying Hugo. And here Peter realized why he did not believe Mr. O when he told him what happened to him and that Hugo was the one who brought him back to Mr. O's farm. Peter told what happened to him, but his father and mother imagined it was a story of his imagination and did not punish him because of Hugo's death. A whole week had passed since that strange incident that Peter had experienced, and after the death of Hugo, and Peter was recovering from the matter with difficulty, and one evening Peter and his father sat after dinner to watch the news, and then a news report was broadcast about the arrest of a gang that specialized in kidnapping children. This report featured the same man and woman who had tried to kidnap Peter before, after they were charged with kidnapping after an off-duty officer suspected them. When Peter saw the man and woman urinate in his pants out of fear, he screamed that these people were the ones who tried to kidnap him a week ago. The terrifying thing was that the man's name was Marcus, and there was a cast on his right arm, the same arm that Hugo had bitten. Here, Mr. George believed the story that Peter had told them a week ago. On the evening of that day, Mrs. Lydia entered Peter's room asking him about the cause of the blood under his shoes. She was very upset. At that time, Peter did not want to talk about the matter, but he kept thinking whether what saved him that day was the ghost of Hugo, or whether it was another wolf mongrel, or maybe just a regular wolf. More than 16 years have passed since that incident, but it seems that Peter never forgot that incident, even though he searched a lot for an explanation for what happened or a logical reason, but he did not find it. Peter grew up and enrolled in university studies. He studied veterinary medicine because he loved animals. After graduating, he worked in more than one hospital and veterinary clinic to gain sufficient experience. In the meantime, he met Ruby, whom he fell in love with and decided to marry her. A few months after the marriage, Peter and Ruby learned that she was pregnant, and here they both decided to make a radical change in their lives. He decided Peter wanted to go live with his father and mother and open his own veterinary clinic. The idea was good, and that is why Mr. George encouraged Peter to implement this idea. Indeed, construction work began on the farm. Mr. George allocated a piece of land to Peter on which to build the house and the clinic on which he wanted to work. Peter and Ruby began the moving work, but Ruby felt that the effort involved in the moving was making her feel extremely exhausted and tired, and when she told Peter, he decided to leave her at his father and mother's house until he finished everything related to the moving process and preparing the new house, and then she would move there. Peter was afraid that anything might happen that might harm her health or affect his child, so he made sure to provide everything for Ruby's comfort and health, and his father and mother helped him in that. Meanwhile, Peter was constantly traveling between cities in order to transport their belongings from the old house or buy some pieces of furniture for the new house, as well as agreeing with medical device and equipment companies to furnish his clinic, and everything was going well. During one of Peter's trips on the road opposite the forest, and before arriving at his father's farm, he felt that the brakes on his car were not working, and here he tried to stop his car more than once, but unfortunately, it did not work. The car deviated from the road and fell a short distance away, but that distance was enough for the car to be completely hidden from any person or other car passing on the road. The car was upside down, and Peter was trapped inside it. He could not moving or getting out of the driving seat. Peter could have unbuckled the seatbelt in the car, but he did not want to do that because he feared that he would fall and get hurt more. So he surrendered to the matter and did not move from his position, waiting for God to send him help for him. But long hours passed. Peter gradually began to lose consciousness until he lost consciousness completely. Meanwhile, he dreamed that he was still young, at the age of 10. He was running and heard Hugo's voice coming from afar, and then he was able to see Hugo in front of him. So he walked behind him until he reached Mr. O's house, and here Peter returned to. He became conscious, and then he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Peter did not know at the time whether he was actually hearing footsteps or if his imagination was playing with him, but only seconds had passed, and he found a dog standing near the car window. It was difficult for Peter to see the dog clearly, but he was certain that this dog standing a few steps away from him is Hugo, his dog who died 16 years ago. Peter tried to speak and asked the dog to go get help, and here the dog moved away from the car. Peter imagined that he had gone and would not return, but within seconds the dog began barking, loud and clear. His voice was like howling. After a few minutes, a car stopped beside the road, and two young men got out and headed to where the dog was. When they saw Peter's car next to the road, they immediately called the police to come and rescue Peter. The two young men waited for 10 minutes until a car arrived, the police and then the emergency vehicle, and they took Peter out. Peter was unable to speak after he got out of his car, but he insisted on looking at the dog to confirm whether it was Hugo or not. Indeed, Peter looked at the dog one look and was sure that it was indeed Hugo. But seconds later, he lost consciousness again, and he only woke up while he was in the hospital, surrounded by his wife, father, and mother. When Peter woke up, his father, mother, and wife tried to reassure him. Fortunately, Peter only suffered some minor bruises, and he repeatedly lost consciousness due to being placed in the car upside down. 2 days after Peter was in the hospital, he asked one of the nurses to ask for anyone who was there for him at the scene of the accident, and indeed, the nurse brought him one of the men who were on board the emergency vehicle to save him. Peter spoke to the man and asked him about the dog, but the man completely denied the presence of the dog at the scene of the accident. Peter left the hospital and headed towards his new home with his wife on his father's farm, but even then he did not stop thinking about what happened on the day of the accident. After his health improved and he was allowed to move freely again, he went to the police station and asked to talk about the officers who had come to scene of the accident to rescue him, who confirmed that they did not see anything, and there was no dog at the scene or around the car. But all this was not enough for Peter. He decided to ask the policeman who spoke to him for the number of one of the two young men who reported the incident. Here, Peter called the number that the police had given him and contacted its owner. A young man named Mike was from the same area where Peter lives, and his friend Sam was with him. They agreed to go and meet both young men. Mike and Sam welcomed him very much and felt happy that he was fine. Peter thanked them very much for saving him that day, and he made sure to ask them how they knew about the accident, as the car was under the road and it was difficult for anyone to find it. Here, Mike spoke, saying that he and Sam were on the road leading to the farms when they saw a dog on the road standing and barking loudly as if he was asking anyone for help. Indeed, when they stopped next to the road, the dog began to calm down, and then he walked towards the car, and here the two young men saw the car and became afraid. They did not want to intervene so that the situation would not get worse, so they decided to call the police. And after the police and emergency services arrived and picked up Peter, the dog completely disappeared. Peter did not understand what the dog had completely disappeared meant, and Sam told him that after the emergency vehicle carried him, he was afraid that the dog would move and get lost because he thought the dog was Peter's dog. But as soon as the emergency vehicle moved, Sam stopped looking for the dog, but he did not find it anywhere. Sam and Mike tried to enter the forest and call for the dog, but to no avail. Peter thanked them again, but only then was he sure that he was not imagining and it was not a figment of his mind because of the incident. Days passed and Peter completed furnishing his home and clinic and began his work immediately. At first the work was slow, but over time everyone knew the location of the new veterinary clinic, and that is why they came to Peter to obtain medical consultations and treat the animals. Peter was happy with the success he had achieved and felt that the decision to return was sound. Ruby reached the last month of her pregnancy, and one evening she felt labor pains. The pain was increasing very quickly, so Peter had to act until the emergency vehicle arrived. Indeed, Ruby gave birth before the emergency vehicle arrived, and it was a beautiful baby, confirmed by Mrs. Lydia, Peter's mother. He is an identical copy of Peter when he was young. Peter's family was very happy, and everyone cared for little George, especially the grandfather, who loved little George with all his heart. A whole year passed, and the family celebrated the birth of little George, but in the meantime, Peter began to feel the presence of something in the house. At first, he did not distinguish what this thing was, But after concentrating, he realized that perhaps this thing was the spirit of his dear, late dog, Hugo, and he was sure of it when he began to notice Hugo in various places in the house, especially the door of the house in the evening, and specifically when Peter returned from work. It was confusing and incomprehensible to Peter, but he did not feel worried, and he did not tell anyone else what he felt, and his explanation for what was happening was that perhaps he had great nostalgia for his late dog, especially since Hugo had accompanied him since he was only 1 year old, same as little George's age at this time. This continued for several months, and then Peter's wife, Ruby, told everyone that she felt that there was something in the house. She felt it, but did not see it, and she did not feel anxious or afraid for him. Lydia and Big George did not believe her, but Peter told her that he believed her and felt what she felt. At first, Ruby thought that he just wanted to support her and not make her feel alone, but she was surprised by him telling her everything that she also felt, and here Ruby was sure that everything she felt was true and not insinuations. Ruby did not stop researching the matter. She wanted to understand what was happening with her and Peter, and here she found a psychic who specializes in communicating with pets. When she spoke to him and told him everything that happened between them and Hugo, or the spirit of the dog Hugo, he explained this to her. The psychic means that there is a spiritual reconciliation between Hugo and Peter, and that Hugo's spirit is Peter's guardian angel, which is why it is natural for Hugo to appear to protect Peter at times when Peter really needs help. And although the explanation seemed superstitious, Peter did not object to it. Rather, he felt happy that Hugo's spirit was still with him, as he had not forgotten him since he was young. Years passed, and little George became 4 years old. One time he was with his grandmother, Mrs. Lydia, and she was supervising the work on the farm. Meanwhile, the workers were digging a new well on the farm in order to provide water to this part of the farm. After the workers left, they left the well as it was. And they left their tools around it because they would return in the morning to complete the work. Meanwhile, little George ran away from his grandmother, and no one saw him. Grandmother Lydia noticed the disappearance of little George, and she and a number of workers working the night shift on the farm began searching, but to no avail. Grandmother Lydia felt very frightened and began to cry as she called Peter and told him everything that had happened. Peter and Robbie felt terrified and went out of their house towards the work area to search for little George, but to no avail. They searched everywhere, and one of the workers called the police to report the disappearance of little George. Everyone was in a state of intense tension. Some were searching and crying, but to no avail. The night had spread, and the sky had turned dark, but the workers insisted on turning on the additional lights in order to illuminate the entire farm to facilitate the search process. About 6 hours after little George had disappeared and close to midnight, everyone heard a howling sound. They could not tell whether it was the sound of a dog or the sound of a wolf, but Ruby was crying hard because she thought of the worst and feared that this wolf had preyed on her young child. So she went in the direction of the sound, and most of the workers came behind her, with Peter and even Grandma Lydia and Grandpa George. When Ruby reached the source of the sound, she did not find any wolf, but she heard the sound of a child's laughter, and she felt from within that these laughs were coming from her child. She continued walking in the direction of the sound until she reached the place of the dug well, and then she found her child at the bottom playing in the sand and laughing as if he had something or someone petting him. Peter did not wait for the emergency vehicle to arrive to rescue the child. Rather, he asked one of the workers to bring him a ladder, and he actually went down to the well and carried his son and climbed up. The child was completely healthy, and nothing bad happened to him. No one could find an explanation of what happened. Only Peter and Robbie knew that it was Hugo, who intervened for protection again.